Have you ever played the game called Risk? It's a board game, and on the board is a big map of the world, and you get an army that's all yours, all these little pieces of your army, and the aim of the game is essentially to conquer the world. It kind of plays on our desires to be in charge, to dominate, to control, to win. And it constantly asks you the question, what are you prepared to risk in order to achieve any of that? The game is designed, I think, to reflect the reality of our human nature, that desire to have control and win. But it's also designed to be a reflection on world history and all of the kingdoms and empires that we've seen come and go across all of the course of world history. Now, in that time, of course, they've always been, could I refer to them maybe as the little people? They're just ordinary, regular people who, farmers, bakers, carpenters, mums at home with kids, those people who just get on with their lives and are just doing the simple, regular, everyday things of life. But at the same time, if you zoom out from those, you'll find that there's this bigger sort of empire, kingdom thing going on where they are part of some country or some kingdom or some empire which is governing a particular area. And that country or that empire is constantly trying to defend its territory or seeking maybe to conquer more territory. It's kind of the same today, isn't it? We see this argy-bargy between all of the different nations. There's those who are, aggressive and they want more control. There are those who are passive and kind of just fly underneath the radar. And then there are those countries that sort of just get caught in between, kind of like Australia does on many occasions. Well, today we're studying Daniel chapter 8. Now, the big idea of Daniel chapter 8 is this, that worldly, earthly kingdoms, they come and they go, but God is in control of everything and his kingdom is eternal. His kingdom never ends. Let me just say that again. The big idea, Daniel chapter 8, is that worldly kingdoms, they come and they go. But God is always in control and his kingdom is the one that is eternal and it will never end. Right now, in this time that we are living, 2020, as we look at the state of the world and all of the geopolitics that we see in the world, there's kind of this proxy Cold War going on between the United States and China. And as we see this happening around us, I think Daniel chapter 8 is a really good reminder to us that worldly, earthly kingdoms, they come and go, but God is still in control. And his kingdom is the one that is eternal, that will never end. Daniel chapter 8 is the second of the apocalyptic visions that God gives to Daniel. Now remember last week we learned that this word apocalypse means to reveal, to show, to put on show for someone. So that's what this idea of apocalyptic means. But the vision that we've got here in chapter 8, it's not as broad in its scope as the vision that we're getting here this week in chapter 8. Chapter 7 was much broader. Chapter 8 sort of narrows it down in its scope. There is a correlation with chapter 7, as there is also a correlation to chapter 2. Remember the dream that King Nebuchadnezzar had. That we saw back then. Here, let me just throw up a table that will give you a little bit of an idea of this. So along the top here, we've got the chapters and then the interpretation over here. So in chapter 2, remember we had the statue, the King Nebuchadnezzar, he dreamt about this statue and it had the head of gold and the chest of silver and the tummy of bronze, and then it had the feet of the iron and clay. And there was a supernatural event, and then this stone that ultimately overcame everything. That was what we saw in chapter 2. In chapter 7, what we looked at last week, so we had the sort of 3, then 4 beasts. So we had the lion, the bear, and the leopard, and they correlated to the gold, silver, and the bronze. We had this indescribable beast, which corresponded to the iron/clay legs and feet. And we've got the heavenly court that was there in chapter 7 as well. If we jump across then to the interpretation, so we said the gold is equivalent of the lion. The symbolism was the Babylonian Empire. The silver was the equivalent of the beastly bear, which represented the Persian Empire, and so forth. Bronze, leopard, Greek, and so forth down the line with the interpretation. Now, this week, what we're looking at is chapter 8, and we've got these two new symbols. So we've got the ram and we've got the goat. And where they fit in correlation to all these others is, as you can see here. So they fit here with the silver, the bronze, the bear, the leopard, and the interpretation of the Persian and the Greek empire. So what we're talking about today is as I said, it's not as broad as chapter 7. It's narrowed down a little bit to just include the Persian and the Greek empires. So that's what we're looking at in today's. Now, the one thing that's not the same as chapter 7, remember last week there was a little horn. It described this little horn. And today we see another little horn. Now, the little horn last week represented what the New Testament speaks of as the man of lawlessness or the capital A Antichrist. There's no correlation between the two. So the little horn that we're looking at today is not the same as the little horn that we looked at last week. They're both little horns, but they symbolize different things, as I'll explain along the way. All right, well, let's get into it. Daniel chapter 8, verse 1, it says this: "During the 3rd year of King Belshazzar's reign, I, Daniel, saw another vision, following the one that had already appeared to me. In this vision, I was at the fortress of Susa in the province of Elam, standing beside the Ulai River," or that word there, river, it's probably in the Hebrew more like waterway. It was actually a canal, a man-made canal, and it joined two rivers together, but the NLT uses the word river there, so let's go with it. Anyway, so this vision happens 2 years after the first vision that God gave Daniel, which is the one that we looked at last week. Timeline, it's about 550 BC, give or take. Daniel is in Babylon. He's serving under the Babylonian king Belshazzar, the bratty, arrogant guy that we've seen before. And we know him to be the last Babylonian king. So Daniel gets this vision about 10 years before all these events start unfolding, which is pretty amazing when you think about it. And because this vision is just so accurate, like it is so accurate against world events, that skeptics have often thought that you just couldn't be this accurate. So they think that this was written much later, after a lot of these events happened, and then was just put back into the book of Daniel in the spot where we see it in the scriptures today, which is what you've got to do if you don't believe that God exists. If you don't believe that God exists, if you don't believe that God could do such a supernatural thing as give somebody a vision like this, well, that's the only explanation that you've got to come up with. But God gave this vision to Daniel while he was still there in Babylon. Now, if you read the book of the prophet Ezekiel, and he was a contemporary of Daniel's, you'll be familiar with the vision that God gave him where Ezekiel was transported in his vision to Jerusalem. Well, a similar thing is going on here in that God, in this vision, he's transporting Daniel not to Jerusalem but to the city of Susa. Now, it's about 320 kilometres east of Babylon. And it's not a big deal at the time because, remember, it's the Babylonian Empire. But in the time of the Persian Empire, it is a big deal. In fact, it becomes one of the 3 royal cities of the Persian Empire. This is where, say, Nehemiah was serving in the courts of the king. That was in Susa before he was then allowed to go to Jerusalem to help rebuild the walls of the city. This is where the book of Esther takes place. Remember Esther and Mordecai and Haman and all of those dudes. So this is Susa in the future. God gives Daniel, he reveals to Daniel this city of Susa and what it's going to be like in the future. I think that's the only reason why he takes him there, because it's not a big deal at the time, but God is showing Daniel that a time is soon coming when Babylon isn't going to be the epicenter of world power. Let's pick it up in verse 3. "As I looked up, I saw a ram with 2 long horns standing beside the river. One of the horns was longer than the other, even though it had grown later than the other one. The ram butted everything out of his way to the west, to the north, and to the south, and no one could stand against him or help its victims. He did as he pleased and became very great." You don't normally think of a sheep when it comes to, when you're using the term beasts or beastly, you don't sort of think little sheep, little lambs. That always just seems so gentle. But the male ram, like the male sheep, the ram, it can put on some ferocious if it needs to, particularly the ones with horns. I grew up on a farm, and one of the things we did on the farm was we would breed what was called first cross sheep. Now that's where you took a merino ewe and you crossed it with a border Leicester ram to get what they called a first cross. Now these border Leicester rams, they were crazy. Like they would, and we had to have some of these. And they would fight each other to determine who was the leader, who was the head of the pack. And they'd fight each other by just charging at one another and just smashing their foreheads against one another until one literally died. Like they'd just go, and I saw it happen on a couple of occasions. I didn't get there in time. My dad would often say to me, get in that paddock and stop those rams from killing each other. And you have to try and get in the middle of them and separate them and do all of this. But they would literally just smack heads until one of them had such a trauma that it literally died on the spot, which was kind of crazy, but that's what they did. So rams do this butting thing. That's how they exert their dominance. And in Daniel's vision, which gets explained a few verses down, so I'll resist the temptation of explaining it here, there's this ram with these two horns, one bigger than another horn, and it just butts everything out of its way. North, south, east, it just completely dominates. Because rams eat utes for breakfast, right? Also the saying goes, but not for very long. Let's pick it up, verse 5. While I was watching, suddenly a male goat appeared from the west, crossing the land so swiftly that he didn't even touch the ground. This goat, which had one very large horn between its eyes, headed toward the two-horned ram that I had seen standing beside the river, rushing at him in a rage. The goat charged furiously at the ram and struck him, breaking off both his horns. Now, the ram was helpless, and the goat knocked him down and trampled him. No one could rescue the ram from the goat's power. So kind of unexpectedly, from the west, and with great speed, this goat comes charging at the ram. And it's got this one big horn. It's like a unicorn goat. This one big horn right in the middle of its head. And it smashes this ram. And as it smashes the ram's two horns are broken off. And this ram is rendered helpless. And the goat just tramples it on the ground. Pretty much taking over everything that the ram once had. So the male goat can be pretty fearsome too. All right, we'll keep going. We'll explain this in a minute, but we'll keep going for now. Verse 8. The goat became very powerful, but at the height of his power, his large horn was broken off. In the large horn's place grew 4 prominent horns pointing in the 4 directions of the earth. Then from one of the prominent horns came a small horn whose power was very great. It extended toward the south and the east and toward the glorious land of Israel. Its power reached to the heavens, where it attacked the heavenly army, throwing some of the heavenly beings and some of the stars to the ground and trampling them. It even challenged the commander of heaven's army by cancelling the daily sacrifices offered to him and by destroying his temple. The army of heaven was restrained from responding to this rebellion, so the daily sacrifice was halted and truth was overthrown. The horn succeeded in everything it did. You might remember last week we had the indescribable beast, and it had 10 horns, and then 3 of those 10 horns were kind of uprooted because this little horn came up through and dominated everything. Well, the imagery here is a little bit the same, as we'll see, but the meaning is not the same, as I said before. So we had this goat with the one sort of unicorn big horn in the middle. This goat come and dominate the ram and trampled it and took it out of the scene. And then this one horn gets broken off, and out of the space on the goat where this one horn was, we get 4 horns growing out of the goat. And then from one of those 4 horns, we get this small horn. And this small horn is pretty ferocious. And this small horn causes all sorts of havoc in Israel, all sorts of havoc for the people of God, all sorts of havoc for Jerusalem and the Israelites generally. And so, just leaving it at this point, the situation doesn't look very good at all. But we get some more. Check this in verse 13. Then I heard two holy ones talking to each other. One of them asked, "How long will the events of this vision last? How long will the rebellion that causes desecration stop the daily sacrifices? How long will the temple and heaven's army be trampled on?" The other replied, "It will take 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the temple will be made right again." There's speculation that the two heavenly beings that are talking here are not just angels, but one of the angels is the angel Gabriel, who is revealed in the next couple of verses. But what's the bigger debate about verses 13 and 14 here is about how to understand what's being said here with regard to the figure 2,300. Is this saying 2,300 days, or is this saying 2,300 sacrifices? Or is it just, totally symbolic? Because if it's sacrifices, and most commentators, theologians these days have decided that it's the 2,300 is actually sacrifices. So what that means is we're talking about a period here of 1,150 days, or a bit over 3 years, that this period of desecration that they're talking about at the temple in Jerusalem is going to happen for. And we'll see in just a moment where this fits in, but it fits in rather neatly. Let's pick it up in verse 15. As I, Daniel, was trying to understand the meaning of this vision, someone who looked like a man stood in front of me, and I heard a human voice calling out from the Ulai River, "Gabriel, tell this man the meaning of his vision." As Gabriel approached the place where I was standing, I became so terrified that I fell with my face to the ground. "Son of man," he said, "you must understand that the events you have seen in your vision relate to the time of the end." Well, whether it was the angel or someone else, not sure, but Gabriel is specifically referred to here and asked to give Daniel an explanation. This is actually the first time that Gabriel is mentioned in the Bible, in the whole of the Bible. It's here in Daniel. He's more famous for the New Testament, isn't he? Turning up to the Virgin Mary and announcing that she's going to become the mother of Jesus. But here we see Gabriel in the Old Testament. The word Gabriel, by the way, means mighty one, God's mighty one, or God's hero. So when it comes to angels, we're meant, I think, to understand that Gabriel ranks up there pretty highly. And the appearance and the approach of Gabriel to Daniel is enough to scare the heck out of him. And he falls to the ground in fear, which I think we could understand. Now, look, there's a couple of exegetical issues that have the potential here to run us off track, so I just want to mention them quickly before we move on. The first one is in relation to Gabriel refers to Daniel here as Son of Man. Now, you might remember this from last week in chapter 7, and what we found last week is that this was a reference to someone in Daniel's vision who would come in the future, and we worked out that was Jesus, that the God-man, Son of Man, would be Jesus. Now, this reference here in chapter 8 to Son of Man, it's not the same. It's not referring to someone in the future. This is simply the angel Gabriel speaking to Daniel as a human. He's saying, I'm an angel, other guy here, he's an angel, but you're a human. So we're sort of the heavenly beings, you're a human being. Okay, so it's just saying to him, you're a human, not you're Jesus. Okay, just to clear that up. The next issue here, and it comes up again in verse 19, is the reference to the end of time, or the very end of time. The New Living Translation describes it in verse 19. Our temptation, therefore, is to think that this is a reference to the very end of time, like when Jesus returns and it's all over. Pretty persuaded that is not the case. And most commentators and theologians believe that as well. In fact, I think that the ESV translates verse 19 something along the lines of the appointed time of the end. So in other words, this isn't a reference to the very end of all time, but it's the end of the time of this vision, the end of the time that's included in this vision that God's giving Daniel. So we've got the Persian Empire, we've got the Greek Empire. You put those two together, and when it says to the end of that time, it means what's coming at the end there, if that makes sense, which I hope it does. So let's get Gabriel's explanation as to what all of this means. Let's check this from verse 18. While he, Gabriel, was speaking, I fainted and lay there with my face to the ground. But Gabriel roused me with a touch and helped me to my feet. Then he said, I am here to tell you what will happen later in the time of wrath. What you have seen pertains to the very end of time. So that's where it says, or the end of the end of the appointed time. The two-horned ram represents the kings of Media and Persia. The shaggy male goat represents the king of Greece. And the large horn represents the first king of the Greek Empire. The four prominent horns that replace the large horn show the Greek Empire will break into four kingdoms, but none as great as the first. I've commented before that here in the 21st century, we have the distinct privilege of hindsight. We can look back. We can look back on everything that this vision says is going to happen, and we know from world history that it all came true. So this is pretty cool. This is quite amazing. We can kind of fill in even the names of some of these dudes and really give it some great detail. In fact, let's try and do this graphically for us. So the period that we're talking about here in this vision in chapter 8, and remember, this is all starting in the Babylonian Empire. Like Daniel is still in the Babylonian Empire and serving in the Babylonian Empire. It's talking about two empires that will come. So we've got the Persian Empire that's headed by this guy Darius/Cyrus, and a few guys came after him. And then ultimately we then see the Greek Empire, which was headed up by Alexander the Great. Okay, so in this vision, the Persian Empire is the ram. Persian Empire is the ram. So it's the one with the two horns. So one of those horns is the Medes, the other one is the Persians. Now the Medes came first, but the Persians came next, and they dominated the Medes. Hence the horn that came later but grew bigger. So we've got the Persian Empire, and that's the ram. But then we've got the raging goat. This is the Greek Empire. And this is the goat that comes charging from the west. That's important because the Greeks were in the west. And they come charging and they take over the Persian Empire under the leadership of Alexander the Great. Now, he's the large horn in the middle of the head of the goat. Now, one of the things I said about this guy last week was that he took over the world really quickly, hence all the speed with which they speak about the goat here, right? I think last week I said that he died at the age of 30. I looked it up this week. It's actually 33 that he died. So he took over the known world. He ruled the known world and set up the Greek Empire and died all by the time he was 33 years of age. So he's the large horn. The goat is the Greek Empire. Now, when Alexander the Great died, so that's the large horn being ripped off, he was replaced. What they did, rather than have one big leader over everything, he put one of his four generals in charge of four regions within the Greek Empire. So Macedonia and Greece was given to Antipater Cassander. Thrace and Asia Minor were given to Lysimachus. Syria was Seleucus, and Palestine and Egypt was given to Ptolemy. So these four areas were headed by these four guys. Now these are the prominent horns that replaced the large horn on the head of the goat. So it's still the Greek Empire, but it's now led by these four generals. Now, fast forward a little bit after that, and one of the descendants here that come from the Seleucids in Syria is a guy called Antiochus, or officially Antiochus IV, but he called himself Antiochus Epiphanes. Epiphany is a manifestation of God. He had very healthy view of himself and thought of himself as a god. He came along and he wasn't satisfied with just the area that was originally allocated under the Greek Empire, and so he starts to advance his little empire. It was never as never as great or as big as the Greek Empire, but certainly he went outside of this original area that was given to him. So this guy then is the small horn. He is the small horn that comes from the prominent horns. And this is the guy that ends up in Israel. This is the guy that ends up in Jerusalem. This is the guy that ends up creating all of that havoc for God's people, the Jews there in Jerusalem. And all of the rest of the vision that God gives to Daniel is about this guy. So everything that we look at now from here on is all about the exploits of this particular chap, who is the small horn, and what he does with God's people. So let's pick it up in verse 23. At the end of their rule, and by that that's a reference to the four prominent horns, so the four that were ruling after Alexander the Great, when their sin is at its height, a fierce king, a master of intrigue, will rise to power. He will become very strong, but not by his own power. He will cause a shocking amount of destruction and succeed in everything he does. He will destroy powerful leaders and devastate the holy people. He'll be a master of deception and will become arrogant. He will destroy many without warning. He will take on the prince of princes in battle, but he will be broken, though not by human power. So about 150 years after Alexander the Great comes this guy called Antiochus Epiphanes, or Antiochus IV. And he comes to power by scurrilous means. He wasn't really the next in line for the throne, but he ends up there because he gets involved in some dastardly deeds. And he advances the territory that was traditionally held by the Seleucids, moving south into Egypt, moving into the area east of Syria, and then to what verse 9 calls the glorious land of Israel. Now, the Seleucids and the Ptolemies, really, in Egypt, both of them had a kind of a hands-off Israel approach, like a hands-off Jerusalem. They didn't want to go near Jerusalem, didn't want to touch Jerusalem. You remember that by this stage, and this should have been an encouragement to Daniel, because it's talking about the temple now being in existence. And when Daniel got this vision, the temple had been destroyed by the Babylonians. So we're now talking about the time where the temple has been rebuilt. And remember, Zerubbabel allowed the temple to be rebuilt, and then Nehemiah came and built the walls around the city and all of this kind of stuff. So this is after the exile, and God's people, the Jews, were allowed to go back to Jerusalem and to be there. And because there was kind of this idea that you didn't touch the Israelites, you didn't touch God's people, you didn't touch the Jews, because God kind of was looking after them, and you touched them at your peril. So no one really went after them until we got to the time of this guy, Antiochus IV. Now, he went to school in Athens. He was schooled in Greek philosophy, and he was totally sold on it. In fact, he thought that the Greek worldview was the only worldview, and everybody should have a Greek understanding, a Greek philosophical understanding of everything. And so as he's trying to exert his power and grow beyond just the traditional area that he was given to govern, and he hits Jerusalem, well, he's got no time for Judaism. He's got no time for the Jews and all of their customs and festivals and rituals and sacrifices and all that kind of stuff. Drives him nuts, and he just says, no, I am going to make the Jewish people Greek. And he sets out on this plan to the official, you say, Hellenize, to make Jerusalem into this Greek place and get rid of all of the Jewish culture completely. Now, this resulted in much persecution for the Israelites. And a lot of this isn't recorded in the Bible. But we do get it recorded in what's called the book of Maccabees. Now, this is in the Apocrypha, which the Roman Catholic Church says should be part of the Bible, and the Protestants say, no, it shouldn't be part of the Bible. Anyway, I'm not going to get into that now, but the details of this time are written in the book of Maccabees. Now, Antiochus, as he takes control, he stops their sacrifices, stops all the sacrifices. He desecrates the temple area by erecting a statue to the Greek god Jupiter. And then he forces them in a way of trying to sort of, highly offend them and get them out of some of their old practices. He forces them to sacrifice, would you believe, pigs. Pigs are the animal that the Jews see as the most unclean of all of the animals. And Antiochus knows this. So the one thing that he forces them to make sacrifices of there in the temple is pigs. So you can imagine how this is going to go down. As a result, many Jews fled Jerusalem. Like they just left the city, got out of town, and they lived out in the wilderness. And while they were living out in the wilderness, a guy by the name of Maccabees becomes kind of the leader. Now, this guy Maccabees has 5 boys, 5 sons, who are often referred to as the sons of Maccabees, or the sons of Maccabees. And these guys would launch raids. They were kind of like guerrilla raids onto Jerusalem to try to defeat the forces of Antiochus. They were trying to win back Jerusalem, which eventually they did. They succeeded. And do you know how long the temple sacrifices were stopped for? Like how long it was after Antiochus said no more sacrifices in the temple, and then when the Maccabees revolt was successful and they were allowed to start their proper sacrifices again? Well, it was pretty much exactly 1,150 days, a bit over 3 years that the temple sacrifices were stopped for. That's from the accounts of world history. Just lines up so well with the prophecy, the vision that God gave Daniel. Antiochus, meanwhile, so this revolt happened and was successful. Antiochus, meanwhile, he's heading east, seeking to gain more territory, more power, heading towards Babylon. And according to the historical records, he just up and died. He just died. He wasn't killed in battle. He wasn't assassinated by anybody. Some records refer to a nervous disorder. But the point is, and this fits nicely with the vision that God gave to Daniel, that says that he, and we know that it's referring to this Antiochus guy, will be broken, though not by human power. So no one killed him, no one assassinated him, but in the end, God took him out. God took him out, which is pretty amazing to see how all the world events has lined up so well with what it says in this vision. All right, verse 26. This vision about the 2,300 evenings and mornings is true, but none of these things will happen for a long time, so keep this vision a secret. So remember when Daniel gets this vision, still in Babylon. Babylonian Empire is still the one that's in power. So it's about 400 years earlier than how these events all play out. So sharing this vision would probably get him, well, one of two things. It would either get him laughed out of the city. It'd be kind of like saying in the year 2450, Canada will be the world superpower, or Australia even. It would be just as laughable probably. Because it really doesn't seem like that right now. Or the second thing is, it may have caused trouble for Daniel with the Babylonians in that it would have seemed seditious. It would have been treasonous to talk about another empire, or even another empire beyond that, taking over and having power. So God tells Daniel to just keep this vision to yourself and hold on to it. Let that be an encouragement to you. But I reckon the Maccabees brothers, I reckon they had a copy. And I reckon the thought of all of this would have come flooding back into Daniel's mind on the night that he had to give that speech to King Belshazzar. Remember, with the hand writing the message on the wall that your reign is now over. When we looked at that, Daniel gave that interpretation with just such confidence. It was almost so matter of fact. And I think, he gave that pronouncement after God had given him this vision, which I think gave him the confidence to pronounce the end of the Babylonian Empire. And we finish with this verse 27. Then I, Daniel, was overcome and lay sick for several days. Afterwards, I got up and performed my duties for the king, but I was greatly troubled by the vision and could not understand it. Sometimes you watch a really good movie, and I know that's very rare these days, but sometimes you just get totally absorbed in the story. You're in the cinema and you're watching this movie and all the surround sound and everything's happening to you. And you just, the characters and the events and the stories just unfolding, and then it sort of ends. And it kind of takes you a while afterwards to sort of get your head back in the game before you walk out of the cinema and the sun's shining. It's like, whoa, I'm in Springfield, 2020, okay. I reckon that's probably a little bit of what's happening to Daniel here. I mean, he's been taken in this vision to another city, and he's been given 400 years of world history all played out. And then all of a sudden, bang, oh, you're back in Babylon, Daniel, get on with it. Well, he couldn't, not straight away. And they didn't have television back in those days, so this would have really freaked him out, right, to just have something revealed to him like this. And he just admits here, it took me a few days to get my head back in the game. It took me a little while, and I kind of think that sounds reasonable. Fair enough. All right, let's sort of conclude this all together in a sense. Isn't God's word amazing? Isn't God's word amazing? I mean, to read this vision here in Daniel chapter 8 and just see how accurate, how it just played out exactly as God told Daniel that it was going to play out. I just think that's amazing. But I think that probably should be the case, though, isn't it? Like, if God is God, if God really is sovereign, if God really is in control of all things, and he is working out his plans and purposes in the world, and if he chooses to reveal some of those plans and purposes of how that's going to go down, well, why wouldn't it be amazingly true? Why wouldn't it be exactly the way it's going to happen? Like, if God is God, well, why wouldn't it be exactly accurate? So when God reveals to Daniel what's going to happen for the next 400 years, and we who live after that, like some 2,500 years later, we can look back on that and say, wow, that actually happened. Like exactly the way God said it was going to happen. That's how it happened. Then yes, that's amazing, but we probably should expect no less from God. Like, God wouldn't be God if he couldn't do that kind of stuff. But God is who he is. He is almighty. He is all-knowing. And he does know all of these things. So we should expect no less from him. And we should expect no less from any of the promises that God has made to us about events that are going to happen into the future. Get it? Which is why, for example, when the Apostle Peter writes to the suffering churches of Asia Minor, and he says things to them like, because of your faith in Jesus, because you've believed that Jesus' death on the cross has paid the price for your sins, because you believe that his righteousness covers you, because you believe that you are clothed in the righteousness of Christ and are reconciled to God the Father, and you're now in this eternal relationship with him, because you believe those things, then your future is secure, your future is amazing, your future is wonderful. Because of Jesus, you guys have an inheritance. It's going to be yours. Let me remind you. Let's have a look at this. 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 3, or the end of 3 to 5. He says, now we live with great expectation, and we have a priceless inheritance, an inheritance that is kept in heaven for you, pure and undefiled, beyond the reach of change and decay. And through your faith, God is protecting you by his power until you receive this salvation, which is ready to be revealed on the last day for all to see. See, God encouraged Daniel in the middle of living in Babylon, of God's people living in exile. God encourages Daniel that in how it's all going to play out in the end. And here, as we live in the 20th century, we live in a broken and a hostile world. God encourages us from his world by how it's all going to play out in the end. And what he says to us is, if you have faith in Jesus, then it's going to go well for you. If you have faith in Jesus and your faith in Jesus is solid and true and genuine, then you don't need to fear anything that's going on now. You don't have to fear anything that's going on in the future, because God has secured for you an inheritance that no one can take away from you. And this is a promise that we get from God, a God who doesn't change, a God who does what he says he's going to do. So when we say, lift your eyes to heaven, when we say, just focus on God's kingdom, we're not talking pie in the sky kind of optimism. We're not talking wishful thinking here. This is information, communication that we have received from Almighty God, the one who's got a proven track record in saying how things are going to go down. So we can trust him. We can trust him for that. So as we look at passages like Daniel chapter 8, and we see God interacting and telling us how things are going down, and then we see them all happening, this gives us great confidence So let it do that for you. Let it fuel the confidence in your salvation. Let this chapter encourage you to persevere through whatever it is that you might be going through in your life right now. Persevere knowing that this is how it's going to roll out at the end. Let this grow your faith. Let it grow your faith and give you a greater resolve to be trusting in God and to be obeying what God commands. And hey, if this applies to you, let this chapter convince you that having faith in Jesus is the most sane, is the most obvious, is the most rational, is the most urgent thing that you can do today. It's not a risk to put your faith in Jesus because it's guaranteed by God. The God who says what he's going to do, the God who never changes, and the God who does exactly what he says he's going to do. I hope you're encouraged by that. I am. Let's pray. Father, thank you so much for passages like Daniel chapter 8. Thank you for the encouragement that they are, that you are a God who is in control of all things. You know how it's all going to play out. You know that the kingdoms of this world will come and go, and whether it's the Americans or the Chinese or the Russians or whoever it might be, these kingdoms will come and go, as we've seen kingdoms in the past, from the Greeks to the Persians to the Romans. All of these kingdoms come and go, but your kingdom, God, will last forever. Thank you that we can be part of your kingdom through faith in Jesus. Help our trust in you to grow because of how we've seen your word be true, of how we've seen world history just so live out everything that you've said is going to happen. God, that just gives us great confidence that everything else that you tell us is going to happen, like our salvation, like our glorification, like our position in your family and this inheritance that we have as your children, that will be ours. Just as much as, yes, the Persian Empire and then the Greek Empire followed the Babylonian Empire. Father, thank you for these things that give us this confidence, grow our faith, grow our trust, and grow our joy and our peace, that we can live in a world where so much is wrong and so many things that would grieve you and grieve us, that it would allow us to live in a way that we can live with peace and we can get about the business of pointing people to you, Jesus, the way, the truth, and the life. And we ask this in your mighty name. Amen.